Hey everybody, my name is Ted Forbes and welcome back to another episode of The Art of Photography. And today we're going to continue on with yet another TLR. And in case you guys can't tell, I'm at least at one point in my life, and probably still today, I'm a little bit of a TLR nerd. I've got a ton of these things and I love showing them off. And the reason is because, you know, from medium format cameras that are capable of producing wonderful images, they have a very interesting place in history. Most of these are around 50, 60 years old. And I love the limitations on these and the way they force you to come up with workarounds and think a little bit differently. And I've always just been a big TLR fan. But our subject today, we're going to talk about the Ansco Automatic Reflex. Now, the Ansco Automatic Reflex is a really interesting camera. They came out, they were produced only for about 5 years, from about 1947 to 52 or 53, I believe. And they've got kind of an interesting story behind them. And as you guys probably know as photographers, the United States is known for producing a lot of wonderful things. Camera design is not one of them. And this was kind of the last failed attempt for the US to get into the pro level high-end camera market. And it's got a little bit of an interesting story behind it. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes. There's a gentleman by the name of Rick Oleson who does camera repair, and I believe he's out of Houston, Texas, down the street. And he has a lot of information on this. And, you know, this was kind of a little bit of a dodo bird of cameras. There was, you know, they went extinct and there wasn't a lot of information on it for a long time. And I hate to say that I actually own 3 of these. First one I bought had fungus in the lens, which was really unfortunate to the point where you could notice it in the image. And then the second one I bought was this one, which worked fine, and then I actually have a third which has the flash sync on it. But that aside, I'll give you a little bit of a history and context for this camera. So, and we'll do a little up close in a second, but I want to, you know, talk about it a little bit first. The Ansco came out in 1947. So if you consider the political climate and economic climate in the place the world was in the, you know, second half of the 40s, you know, World War II is over and Germany is still struggling to get back into production with Rolleiflex and other cameras that they were producing. Japan has a very unique financial situation at that point, and they're not really putting anything out. And the US company, US-based Ansco, decided that they would take a stab and enter this high-end market. And so they built what's really quite a fascinating camera. Again, it's like a Swiss watch when you get in there to take it apart with the shutter and the way the aperture blades work. It's typical of TLR design, much like the Rolleiflex, in the sense that you do have twin lens, you have the viewing lens and the taking lens. And the way the shutter works, it's a leaf shutter. So if you have the flash model, you can get flash sync at lots of speeds. However, beyond that, there's not a whole lot of similarities in design to the Rolleiflex. They did a lot of things completely different on here. It's a bit of a tank. It's supposed to be made out of aluminum, but if you drop this, you will injure yourself. It's quite heavy, and it really is an army tank of sorts. We'll get up close in a second, and I'll get into detail with these, but one of the interesting things that Ansco did with this camera was they were having trouble building this and keeping it even sane for the high end. When these came out, they listed for around $250, $260. And in today's terms, if you look at an inflation calculator, and this is US dollars, that ends up being probably about $2,600 or so and up. And so these were really expensive, and they were trying to find ways to produce them so where they wouldn't have to build any more cost onto what they figured was their top line. And so one of the things you'll notice on this camera is the lens is not the greatest in the world. It is a triplet-based lens. f3.5 is the widest aperture, and it's an 83 millimeter lens, which is quite interesting. You'll note that the standard, you know, the standard focal length on a medium format is usually 80 millimeters. So what's with the extra 3? Well, what they were doing was, because they were using a triplet-based design, they're competing with Rolleiflex and with the Tessar design, which is basically the 4-element 3 groups. And essentially what they did on this was they made the focal length bigger so they can increase sharpness on the edge-to-edge of the focal plane in the frame. And what's funny is the marketing team comes out and you find old ads from back then, and they were saying that, you know, it produces a bigger image. And most of us that understand focal length know that 3 millimeters on 120 format is not much at all. But it's funny how they kind of spun that from a marketing angle, but really in reality it was just, you know, it was to get a sharper picture on the lens, which really isn't a bad workaround technically. It's just very interesting that that's kind of, you know, one of the few cameras of this type that do that. There are a couple others, but this was the big one. So let's go up and close with the Ansco Automatic Reflex, and I'll show you how this thing works. Okay, so we're looking at the Ansco Automatic Reflex, and you're going to notice this is a very heavy-duty camera. Like I said earlier, don't drop this on your foot. You will break it. Your foot, not the camera. It is a tank, and it is a battle axe. But it's got some wonderful features and some really interesting designs on here, and we'll kind of go around the camera and I'll show you how this works. So basically, the lens here is a 3.5 is the max aperture, and basically on the front of the camera you're going to have your viewing lens, your taking lens, which, you know, as most TLRs, you're going to be able to look through the viewing lens by opening the viewfinder. And one thing about this camera in particular is the viewfinder, and we're not really looking at anything here but a white wall, but it is not as bright as something like a Rolleiflex or even later with the Hasselblad and other mirror systems. And that's a common design problem that a lot of these early cameras had. So if you're shooting in low light, good luck focusing, because it's going to be kind of hard to see things in here. So really these are optimized for well-lit scenes or daylight. You know, it can be done just depending on how dark it is, but this is just a dim viewfinder compared to a lot of them. Within the viewfinder here, you have, and this is really weird, but you see there's a little series of little buttons down here, and there's a little switch here. And when I release that, it pops up the little magnifying glass, and you are able to close focus. You can kind of see the picture on the wall up there. And that's the focusing aid. And so you just pop that back down. It's not real big. One thing that's really cool about the viewfinder on this is a lot of them, like when we've looked at the Rolleiflex and you know, even the Flexorette, they all have what they call the action finder, which basically you would pop out the inner part of the hood here, and you're just kind of looking at analog framing, so to speak. This one actually attempts to, you know, put another lens in here, and it actually ends up acting kind of like a little box camera or something, but you do see it has a lens element here and also one on the back. So when you're using it as a sports finder, it's probably slightly more accurate, which actually was kind of a cool design without having to put a third lens up there, which you wouldn't want to do. You know, inherent in the nature quality or the nature of the beast of the design on a TLR is that you end up looking down, which, you know, is one of the reasons I like shooting on them, because it's pretty stealth if you're out doing street photography. But if you're doing action photography and you really don't care about being stealth, it is more, you know, cumbersome to use. And the action viewfinder on here does help a little bit. So anyway, that's basically the viewfinder up top. Down on the face of the camera here, you're going to notice there are not one, not two, but there are 3 focusing knobs, and they're all attached. So when I spin the side one here, you're going to see that the center ones move as well. And the idea behind here, and actually it's kind of an interesting and unique design, but you know, on all these, basically when you turn the focusing mechanism, you're going to see the entire housing of the lenses move out when you focus, you know, front and back here, which is normal for these cameras. But what's cool about it is, like, you know, exactly like you're looking at it right now. Let's say we're shooting with this camera, and you know, we're framing up a scene, we're looking down. It allows you to get a better grip on the camera, and you basically can use this to find focus with your thumbs if you don't want to, if you don't have a strap or you don't want to use the side one, because it is kind of a heavy camera. So that is kind of a cool you know, workaround for that, and it's very unique to this camera. So that's basically how focusing is done. It's probably going to be really hard to see in the video here, but this little tiny window up top, basically your aperture is this dial at the bottom, and I'm just going to move it around the lens like that, and this tells you what your aperture is. So, like, you know, down here we're at f32 and then wide open at 3.5, and it tells you what everything is between. So if I'm looking for, here's 5.6, if I want f8, I just look through that little window, and I know that's really hard to tell, probably from the video. This little slot right here, this little hole, basically that's for a cable release, so you can screw a cable release in if you want to fire without using the manual release. Other than that, you're going to see that there's these 2 levers on either side of the viewing lens. I'll turn this around so you can see them, and they're kind of goofy looking, but basically one of these is the shutter. Well, they both control the shutter. This one on the left cocks the shutter, and this one fires it. Now it's locked in firing mode because this camera does have the double exposure lock on it, so you don't accidentally expose twice on one frame. You can do double exposures if you want. Basically what you're going to do is basically turn this little switch here, and that releases it and allows me to take a photo. And so other than that, it must be cranked, and you must advance the film in order to get to the next frame for the exposure lock to come off. And so basically that just is a built-in way of helping prevent doing accidental double exposures, which is kind of cool. Also on this camera, which is interesting, you have your film counter on the side. You know, we're at frame 9 right now, and to advance the film, you just turn this crank. I don't have film in here right now, and then that would move it. So the crank and the shutter are kind of independent of one another, but there is a locking mechanism on there to prevent double exposures by accident. And if you've ever shot on like a Holga or something that has basically nothing on it, you've probably accidentally done double exposures before. So it's nice to have that built in. Other than that, everything's pretty straightforward in the camera. There is a Model 2 version of this, which basically has a little flash sync off to the side, and there was an attachment that was built for that. I don't believe it would work with modern flashes. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that. I'm pretty sure it's just the old flash bulb flashes, which, you know, if you're looking at an MX design, you wouldn't be able to use it with modern flashes. So the flash compatibility on here is pretty moot at this point. One other thing that's really interesting here, and I'll show you how to load the film here. Basically, I'm going to shut this. There's a lever here. Actually, you use these two buttons on the side. This one releases the top. These two buttons on the side release the back. And when you open the back here, so this is getting heavy. When you open the back, this is where you load your film. And you can see on the bottom, there's the spool. I'd move that over to be the taking spool, put your film in there, wind it through, and there's your frame. You can see the leaf shutter inside. Notice the aperture blades. When I change the aperture, you're gonna see them come in and out. So it's a leaf shutter, which is, you know, pretty standard for a TLR camera, and I think much preferable to shutter curtains. Also worth noting here is the warning for best results, use Ansco film, of course. You know, we want to keep it in the family there. The other thing that's interesting about this is the way you load the film. Now, there were some shortcomings to this camera. We discussed one earlier, was the 83mm lens, which was basically designed to use less elements in the lens. So it's not as an advanced lens design as even the Zeiss Tessar, and they're basically cutting a corner to save some money there. So that's why they did this. They put a slightly bigger lens so it would zoom in and you'd actually get a little more coverage on the back, which would increase the edge-to-edge sharpness on the frame. So that's one thing. The other thing that's a little bit of a cut corner on here too is there's no mechanism in here for knowing when the film is at frame 1. And so literally what you have to do is there's a little window on the back and you pop that up. This is really ultra crude, and there's a red window in there. And basically you'll load the film in and then wind it up and wind it up and wind it up until you get to frame 1, and then you go ahead and shut that, cock your shutter, and then it knows it's on the first frame of the roll. And, you know, not certainly the end of the world by any stretch of the imagination, but something that Rolleiflex, Flexoret, and a lot of these other camera companies had a mechanism in there for detecting when you were at frame 1. So usually you'd match up that dot and then wind it up. The Ansco did not. But anyway, that, for better or for worse, is the Ansco Automatic Reflex. And like I said, it's a beast of a camera. There's a tripod mount on the bottom. And it's getting really heavy right now for me to hold and show you in this video. You have a depth of field chart on the back as well. Also interesting, real quick before we end up, is the crank. A lot of them, like on the Rolleiflex design, the crank and the shutter were engaged. So, you know, you would crank to advance the film, then you'd come back and you could pop it back over to cock the shutter. And this one is just kind of loose, but it doesn't feel flimsy. You know, it's wild, but you know, it does have a little you know, gimbal here kind of design on the crank. So if you need the handle, or if you don't want, you push it forward. So anyway, that, folks, is the Ansco Automatic Reflex, built from the 1940s to about 1952. So there you have it, the Ansco Automatic Reflex. And the Ansco lasted only about 5 years in production. And essentially it came out at $250, which was astronomical back in those days. And what ended up happening was Rolleiflex got back into gear and offered pretty much a superior camera. And they were actually selling in maybe $10 less than this. They were going for about $250, and this was about $260 at that point. And so unfortunately what you saw was the decline and the demise of production on these. And I think the last year they were produced, they were selling for $160, and the company wasn't breaking even at that point and decided to discontinue the line. But it's interesting because I think, you know, it's quite an interesting story of basically failed production on, you know, what the United States were trying to do to get into the high-end camera market. The image quality on these is okay. It's not as impressive as I wanted it to be, and mainly I think it's the contrastiness of the lens. I don't have a problem with the 83mm focal length or even the sharpness on here, but I just tend to notice that the pictures that I've taken on here just don't have that beautiful lush contrast that, you know, other high-end, particularly of that era, like Rolleiflex, even the Flexoret, which came out of Czechoslovakia that we talked about. The Czechoslovakian cameras have beautiful contrast, and it's, you know, typically what you also see with the Swiss design, the Hasselblad and all that, but, you know, and these just really don't hold up. They do kind of, I will double back a little bit and say that they do have a very interesting look to them. It's a little bit more faded. If you want images that look like they were taken in the 50s maybe, you know, you're going to get them with this camera. It's just not super quality contrast that comes out of here. But it is a very interesting camera, and obviously I said I own 3 of these, so you can get them pretty cheap now if you look around. eBay is probably the more expensive place to find them. They're just not really a sought-after collector's camera. You'll go through phases. I remember when I first found out about them where, you know, people were collecting them, but, you know, it comes in and goes. This isn't a famous camera by any stretch of the imagination. It's like something like the Rolleiflex 2.8F or something like that. But anyway, that is the Ansco Automatic Reflex. I'm getting really tired of holding this up because it's heavy. And anyway, I'll catch you guys next week on another episode of The Art of Photography. Remember to subscribe to the channel because we're doing 3 shows a week now. We do the longer show, which is what you're watching right now, the show proper, which comes out on Sundays. We do Photo 3s on Wednesdays, and we do a Q&A session on Fridays. So check it out, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next episode. Later.